Today's text is special, and this moment was special for me, as this text was one that was preached at my ordination service about 4 years ago by Michelle Hirschberger, and then to hear it read by Zayla just brings joy to my heart. A passion for me is to see all people able to use their gifts, and for too long throughout history, women have been restricted in their ability to do that, and so it means a lot to me to see that come together today. So I just wanted to say that before I officially begin. So, question for you. Have any of you ever heard of the Wiki Game? Not the Wookiee game, that would be different. But the Wiki Game. It's a game that's played if you're on a device or a computer on the crowdsourced encyclopedia called Wikipedia. So within each of the articles on Wikipedia, when the author refers to something else that is somewhere else in Wikipedia, there's a link made there. And so, for example, if we were to look up the Gospel of Luke on Wikipedia, there are plenty of links in blue throughout the text. And so the Wiki Game basically gives you an article to start with and an article to end with. And the way that you get from one article to the next is you click the links. And so the goal of the game is to be the first and fastest to go from this starting article to the ending article, simply by using links inside that article. And this, I think, is a really interesting idea. It could be a fun game. I've never actually played it myself, but I have clicked around Wikipedia for far too long on occasion. But the reason why I bring this up is because, again, this is something that happens in Scripture all the time. There are links, especially as we read the New Testament, that link us back to stories that happened in the Old. And we get there by these words or phrases that appear throughout the stories. And so as we go through the text this morning, I hope to highlight some of these links because they provide a depth to the passage that I think helps us to understand what Jesus is all about, not just as his individual ministry, but as what God has been doing throughout history. So the Gospel of Luke actually begins with Luke talking about why he's doing it. He's set out to put together an orderly account about the things that have been fulfilled among us. Now, when we think of fulfillment, we often think of maybe something being checked off a list. And so when we're thinking of that in Scripture, we might be thinking, oh, how is this found in the Old Testament? Where can we make these connections? And while finding those connections can be really important, an important thing to know about fulfillment in this sense is that it's more like the idea of Jesus being the climax to the story of the whole interaction that we see between God and humanity in the Bible. And we see this play out in the Gospel of Luke itself, because that's his goal. He wants to set out this orderly account to show how things are being fulfilled. And so if you read through from 1:1 through to 4:15, right before where our text picks up, you might see how Luke is making these connections, making these links. So he talks about there's a voice that cries out in the wilderness. I would connect this to the voice of creation. God spoke, and it became true. And Luke refers to this passage where the mountains are being made low, the valleys made flat, the crooked roads made straight. This reminds me of the way that God organized and made meaning out of creation, like we see in Genesis 1. It wasn't just God speaking, it was God making something ordered and beautiful. When John the Baptist shows up on the scene, he refers to the people as a brood of vipers, a group of snakes. Well, where have we seen a snake before? Genesis 3. in the garden. Then he talks about being fruitful. Be fruitful and multiply was a theme even as the people, as Adam and Eve were sent out of the garden. They were told, be fruitful and multiply. Not just growing great crops, but creating a family. Giving life upon life that multiplies and multiplies. And finally, Jesus' own baptism connects him and us to the story of the Exodus, when the people of God were delivered from slavery, were delivered from oppression. And it also connects to the time where they crossed the Jordan, moving into the promised land, the place that God had for them. And then Jesus spends 40 days in the wilderness, which is likened to the 40 years that Israel spent in the wilderness. So in these 3.5 chapters, Luke basically makes these connections to the story of Israel and Israel's life. And if we are to think of Jesus as the climax to that story, then we can begin to realize how Jesus is living out what God had intended Israel to be. The story continues, the story climaxes in who Jesus is, living out God's story. And that's where then our text picks up. Jesus goes back to his hometown and attends his local synagogue. This was Jesus' custom, as it was the custom of all Jewish people. And the fact that he read from the scroll that day is not necessarily anything crazy, other than maybe he would have been among the few that could actually read. And I could go into all kinds of details on why he was reading and what he was reading and all these practices in the first century synagogue. Or I could go into the narrative details that lead up to it. But I think this would be a classic move of focusing on the wrong things. There is a time and place to explore what's going on, but sometimes we like to focus on the details around the hardest part of a passage so we can ignore that hard part and just talk about, oh, Jesus was doing a nice reading, or Jesus was following in the footsteps of the rabbi before him. And that's why I want to kind of quickly move past this and into the piece that Jesus actually read, because this is where Jesus, as the climax of the story, sets forth what that climax is to look like. And if Jesus is this fulfillment, this climax of the story, then we need to pay attention to what Jesus says here. We need to realize that these aren't just nice words or ideas. And we need to not lose focus on what he says and what he then does. So, he opens the scroll and reads from Isaiah 61. At least that's what we call it now. But again, there's links within this passage to the story of Israel, the story of God and God's people. And I think the first part of this paints a picture of Jesus as the ultimate king. He says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." This is a phrase that pops up in a lot of places, but especially somewhere like Judges and the Samuel King's narratives, in which the Spirit of the Lord comes upon someone so that they may judge. Now, judgment is not like a judge in a law court. This is more connected to this idea of being able to separate good from bad. Now, you'll notice I chose bad instead of evil, because it's not always a moral reality. Those of us who garden, would not necessarily say that weeds are evil, even though we probably don't like them very much. They don't have the ability to make choices. They just do what they do. But to find good being that which helps humans flourish in their lives, is important. It's important to have people, especially those chosen by God, whom the Spirit rests upon, be able to see good and bad and separate the two and do something about it. He continues, because he has anointed me. Well, this adds another layer. David, a great king, for the most part. In 1 Samuel, we see these two phrases put together, the Spirit of the Lord and anointed. And it reminds us of this rule, of this kingly rule that will become part of Jesus' ministry. To be anointed means to be set apart, to be chosen for something special. And so he is saying, without directly saying it, but in a way that the people would not have missed, that he himself, Jesus, is the new king. And then he begins to start to talk about what it means to be that new king. Well, it means to proclaim good news, or just to proclaim goodness to the poor. Poor, meaning not just those who do not have financial means, but poor as those who are isolated because they are different, because they don't have social status. A poor person wasn't just somebody begging on the street, but somebody who did not have access to the community. It was the tax collector who, though he might be financially rich, would be socially poor because of the way that they cheated their brothers and sisters. And so the one who will judge between good and bad is going to give goodness to the poor, radically shifting all that the world would have. Using good news, the Roman Empire's way of talking about conquest. It'll be the poor who inherit the kingdom of God. He goes on to talk about what this kingdom will look like. He says that he is sent to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free. This connects us both to Psalm 46 and Leviticus 25, where these words of release and go free are the same word that we see connected to the Jubilee. Now, in case you're not familiar with this, there is this pattern, or supposed to be this pattern, in the life of Israel, where every 7 years they would have a Sabbath year. So for 6 years, they would go about their normal work. They would farm, they would produce what they needed to produce, and in the 7th year, they would stop. They would stop doing that work, and they would allow the land to produce what it produced, and they would live off of that. And they would live off of the abundance that came in the 6th year. So that would happen, and then following the 7th time of doing that, 7 times 7, 49, so in the 50th year, they would then do the Jubilee Year, where everything was set back, where those who had been imprisoned, those who had had to sell their land, everything would be returned to the way it was supposed to be. So that at least once in your lifetime, you would experience things as they were intended by God to be, not the way that life had brought it to be. It was a way in which things could be set right again, that good would happen instead of the bad. And this year of the Lord's favor, coming from Leviticus 26:9, I will look on you with favor upon you and make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will maintain my covenant with you. The interesting thing is, as I looked into this word year here, it could mean a literal year, but it could also mean an age, a time period undefined. It's kind of like when you say to somebody, "Oh, I haven't seen you in years." We don't literally mean years, and we're pretty imprecise in that time. But It's talking about a time when God's favor will be upon all people, and that we will experience this kingdom forever. So then Jesus rolls up the scroll, gives it back to the attendant. I would love to imagine that this was kind of like a mic drop moment. Of course, you would never do that with a Torah, but that's what it feels like when I read this. This passage that Jesus reads, I think reads like a thesis statement for Jesus' ministry. And I think that's helpful as an academic for me to think of it like that way, because then I can come back to that many times throughout Luke's gospel and say, how is this connecting? But the misleading part of using this word thesis is that we might start thinking of Jesus as somebody writing a really good position paper. He didn't do that. Jesus lived it out. This is when he spoke about what his ministry would look like, and then he went on to do it. I think one of the strongest and perhaps the most valid critiques that I hear of Christians today is that we may waste so much time disagreeing and arguing about ideas that we don't get to the actual work of justice, of peacemaking, of expressing God's love, as we saw in this passage. Because Jesus' work is our work. If Jesus says, this is what I am about, then that is what we are to be about as well. But all too often, we are like the synagogue crowd, that if you were to read on in this passage, loves what Jesus says at first, until they realize that they'd actually have to do something, that they'd actually have to leave the synagogue and live a life in a different way. Once they realize that, once Jesus pushes them towards this idea that they have to live this out, that they'd have to stop living in their comfortable world, they decide they're going to throw him off a cliff. Of course, they're unsuccessful, which we know, but this is a pretty powerful reality, that we can hear these words and think they're great, that we can jump in and say, yes, I'm all for that. But when it comes time to actually do it, are we often worried about losing our comfort, about losing the things that we have now, and worrying about what tomorrow will look like if we were to actually do it? This kind of reminds me of one of my favorite passages from the book of James. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but do not have works? Can faith save you? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm, and eat your fill, and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. Now, these are not easy words, but they pair really well with this climax that Jesus initiates. If Jesus is the climax to the story, and we are to imitate Jesus, then our faith can't be just words. We can't just wish people well. Those words need to be followed by action. Last week, Jess talked about how we could think of this year for Hester Mennonite as the year of love. I think it's interesting that when Jesus reads this passage from Isaiah, he left off a piece of it, the final sentence. But I think he did it on purpose, because this final sentence is about God's wrath. And there's something interesting about God's wrath that I came across not too long ago that really helped me make sense of it, because I want to believe so much in this loving God, in this God that loves us unconditionally. And Perhaps that makes me blind to some things, but I think the reality comes out of this statement that God's wrath is actually God's love wrongly received. God's wrath is God's love wrongly received. Think of it this way. A parent's love for their child sometimes leads them to discipline their child. And it's not out of hate that they do that. It is out of love. It is out of their care for the well-being of this child. And also, when God judges between what is good and bad, God works to bring out good in the place of bad. But sometimes that means pushing against things that are not right. It means challenging the wrong, the injustice in our world. I think Jesus leaves off this part about wrath because if you read the part before it and you truly live that, the confusion is removed. When we see love in action, when we are a people of love, when we make this the year of love, not in the fuzzy, kind of feel-good Valentine's Day way, but in the active 1 Corinthians 13, loving kindness kind of way, the confusion isn't there. We don't confuse love for wrath anymore. We see, we experience, we share the love of God in all that we do, even when it's hard. But this is what Jesus embodies as the climax to the story of God and humanity. Jesus is the epitome of love, from his birth to his death, through the resurrection, and through the sending of the Spirit that we may follow as well. We are imitators of what Jesus does, and so we must do the same. And that's why I would like for us to conclude this sermon time with speaking these words together, to realize that this is not just Jesus' calling, not just Jesus' thesis statement, not just mine because it was part of my ordination, but this is a calling on each one of us, an opportunity for each one of us to be part of what God is doing in our world, be a part of the justice that is sought, a part of the love that we share, a part of the work that we do to transform the world around us and bring justice, peace, mercy, and love into our world. Would you speak this with me? The Spirit of the Lord is on us, because Jesus has anointed us to proclaim good news to the poor. Jesus has sent us to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. As we enter into our time of reflection, I urge you to consider these very seriously, because sometimes it's really easy to walk by and not notice the poor, the captives, the blind, and the oppressed around us. And it's even easier to do nothing, even when we do see them. But may this truly be the year of love for Heston Mennonite Church, not just among ourselves, but in the world that God has placed us in. Amen.